Let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my session at SQLDay Poland. Right now, I am stuck in Belgium. It's just begun raining. It's been a wonderful day for the most part, other than that in Belgium. But especially because it's raining right now, I do enjoy sitting inside and talking to each and every one of you. My name is Benni De Jagere. In the next, let's say 55, 60 minutes, I am going to dive into what we can do to design impactful visualizations for our data. This is going to be the last time that you see the webcam feed right now, because for the majority, the rest of the session, I'll actually just be sharing my desktop view. Yep, so that's coming through perfectly. Well, let's get started. So as I mentioned, my name is Benni De Jagere. And before I do get on, I should not forget this, is I want to thank all of the partners, all of the sponsors that help to make SQLDay Poland work. I organize events myself, and I know how crucial they are to get things started. So it's with utmost pleasure that I explicitly thank them for their assistance in making these things happen. That said, my name, Benni De Jagere, and coming from Belgium, and I engage in this little lovely user group called dataminds.be. We do very similar things like the data community in Poland, meaning we organize events to get people together to share passion and enthusiasm around all things data. If you want to reach out to me on any of the social channels, feel free. My Twitter and LinkedIn handle is on there. Sessionized profile as well. And that's it. Let's get cracking. Before I do get on, I want to set expectations about what we're going to do right now. That means, obviously, for a very small part, it is also setting the expectation on what not to do. What are some common things that we do not want to engage in all that much? And also dive into a bit of a small introduction on the psychology of visualization, because there is a whole lot more that comes into play rather than just slapping some visuals on there and see what sticks. But it matters as much as picking the right visualization, picking the right colors for the job, because those are very crucial in everything that we do. And then lastly, also make sure that we have something called inclusive design, making sure that people with a form of disability, motorical, color blindness, whatever, that they are able to consume the reports that we've designed for them as well. If during this session you're going to see any report, any visualization that I've made myself inside of Power BI, it will be based on this demo use case set, meaning it is the city of New York, and they have this thing called City Bike, which is public bike station, and you pick up a bike, you drive around for it in 20 minutes, and then you put the bike back somewhere else in the city, allowing you for easy transportation other than taking cabs and subways and whatever else exists out there. It is a fairly cool data set because you can find every detail of it online. It goes back to June 2013, which means that in the time span of June 2013 up until now, up until last month, there has been about 112 million transactions. So 112 million trips that have been taken. So it is actually a really good data set to do some demos on, some performance tuning, some testing things on a data set that's not AdventureWorks or not Wide World Importers. The first time I did the session, I held the session for a college university in Belgium, in Mechelen. And I asked them, well, if I say to you visualization, what do you think I mean? And then they started spouting a bunch of things. Some of them were useful and some of them were, well, not useful. The main thing, the most important thing that came up was graphs and charts. It is using these types of visualizations to deliver a message, to tell an actual story to people, to make sure that they understand what we're talking about. And then, yes, obviously pie charts as well. Spoiler alert, I am not a very big fan of pie charts, but I am not going to dive too deep into this right now. And it is also something that they should thought of more often, because it is something that we usually do very quickly. But if we think this through properly, it can actually deliver a message so much more perfectly as well. And then using maps, it looks easy, but it is hard. And well, some people effectively thought that it was just slapping a few things on a canvas and let's get cracking with this. And there were a lot of things that came out of there, but these were the most important points that came up repeatedly. Thing is, data visualization is all around us. We may think that it's just simply for designing reports, for designing dashboards, etc. But data visualization is all around us. For instance, it's a fairly common example that we've seen in many forms, many shapes, but it is in essence people trying to explain how many cubes of sugar are listed inside of a soda beverage. And I'm not going to debate on the fact that this is healthy or not. I'll leave that up to you as well. But any human being that has been taught the value of a sugar cube, how much sugar is in this, can immediately understand that there can be quite a lot of sugar in the larger containers of the soda pop. Which most people would say that, okay, maybe I should think of not consuming that much. So exactly the same message, but displayed a bit differently. How many soda drinks are in a drink? And the 60-ounce container is about the same size as the other one, but that translates to 6 donuts. And then what is this? Let's say about 20, 25 sugar cubes or 6 donuts. To me personally, okay, I know that donuts are not the most healthy consumption that we can have, but I wouldn't say that it's 25 sugar cubes. So to me, the message gets a bit lost in what they're trying to portray here. And then people are actually saying that donuts are healthier than they thought, or maybe that they are craving for a donut right now. So we see data visualizations all around us as well. But there is something to keep in mind before we get into any of this, is we shouldn't fear perfection because we will never reach it. And it is something that is very, very true. There is no such thing as a perfect dashboard. People will always have some form of subjective remark about it, and it will not be perfect for everyone trying to consume it. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't strive for it. We should always strive for perfection, even though we'll never reach it. Data visualization is intelligence made visible, meaning that if we think about the message we try to get across to our different consumers, and we try to do that in the most efficient way possible, that will mean that we will have a smart system of delivering that data for them. And it is an intermediary between information and understanding, allowing us to bridge the knowledge gap in between a large chunk of data and a clear, concise graph that immediately makes us understand what we need to try to understand. And naturally, as I also mentioned, there are things that we shouldn't do. And this is where I can keep going on for hours and hours about not so well designed data visualizations that we found on the internet. I've chosen to one, and I'm not sure on how you're working right now, how your working knowledge of Danish is right now, but this is a graph that I got from the Danish government website, and it is in a nutshell on how many accidents with a lethal injury that have occurred in the years 2018, 2019, and 2020. So the thing is, if I were to ask you what year has had the most accidents with lethal injuries, it's not that easy to take a look at it because it is a completely different way than we're used to when using gauges. We're used to having the actual value, having the value on the gauge itself, and then having the year that we need to be seeing out in the center of the field as well. And it is a really confusing message, and it is just a quick example of how things can go horribly wrong to actually just butcher the message that we try to keep across. And there is, like I mentioned, there is exceptional lots of examples out there, and it is really easy to do something wrong, but that shouldn't be an objection to not try and design data visualizations as well. The thing is that there are also really good examples. And one of the most common examples that's being used is the Charlemagne map of the Napoleon March on Moscow. But I think that this is actually a lot better of an example these days, because these days with crypto and Dogecoin and Bitcoin and Ethereum booming all over the place, everyone is looking at these types of charts. But the beauty of this is that it's actually been designed somewhere in the 1700s. In Japan, because it was initially used for the rice markets over there. So back in the 1700s, they were already thinking about how do we need to visualize this data so that farmers and traders can instantly see when the right time is for buying and selling rice. And for me, that is really incredible, because they could have potentially also just made a giant table where all of this data was located on. But no, they thought about a visual representation. And if you're not completely familiar on how this actually works, this visualization, it is if we take If we take a bar, the fact that it's green or red determines that the period for which it's been running has been an increase or a decrease. So green is an increase, red is a decrease. The value that it starts at is the minimum value at start. The value that it stops at is the maximum value, is the value at the stop time. And then the wicks is the highest point that it's reached during the value and the lowest point during the value. So it allows us to easily see instantly what the trend is being and what the volatility has been on the market as well. So it takes some use to getting used to this type of chart, but it allows you to really easily get the message. And as I mentioned, because of the fact that they were doing this in the 1700s, makes it that extra special. But why should we bother with all this thing called data visualization? Well, the thing is that a good data visualization helps us research the data and try to get knowledge on this. It allows us to investigate some curious cause and effect relationships. But most importantly, it allows us to get an insight into data that we would otherwise not notice because the volume is too large. Because it allows us to easily see in a single image what we otherwise would have to read for about 5-6 minutes to get the same amount of data into us as well. Does that mean that we can get all the nitty-gritty details on that same data visualization? No, but it allows us to quickly understand some relationship or a pattern or a trend that we need to dig into to get deeper on those insights, to allow us to dig into a specific area with more details possible, rather than having to go dig through the entire thing. But most importantly, it is about communicating what we found as a story to other people. So making sure that whatever relationship, whatever result we've made for ourselves can get communicated to other people. And why does this work actually? Why does it work this way? Well, it is simply the fact that our brain is wired to, for the majority of the part, to actually interpret visual information. So 90%, don't quote me on the percentages, is about 90% of these, the processing power that we have in our brain is for visual processing. So we remember about 80% of what we see on the first time, 20% of what we read on the first time. And that is purely because it is designed that way. It is mostly visual processing that our brain is wired to do. So in going into our brain, there's a simple thing that I want you to understand as well. Like I said, I'm not going into the entire complex things of data visualization and how the brain works and what psychology this is, but there's something that you need to know. Our brain has two systems, a faster system and a slow system, on the left-hand side or the right-hand side. So on the left side, we have this thing called the fast system, and it is designed for having those intuitive responses, for having these things at very, very high speed. So even in a matter of a split second, having a reflex. So that's the system that's making decisions for us throughout the entire day. And it is doing that in our unconsciousness because we are actually not actively thinking about this. And then we have, on the other side, we have the right-hand system, which is the slower system. Which is the slower system. And that slower system is what we need to do the more complex thinking. So those more complex analytics to actually allow us to solve things that we cannot see instantly as well. And it is purely designed to focus ourselves, to apply ourselves to get that result. So for instance, if I say to you that you need to count the amount of people in the room, then you will need to focus for yourself as well, especially if people start jumping around, start running around, etc. So it is that focus that is key to solving those issues. And to give you an example, I'm going to show you the next slide, and there's going to be two things on there. So on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side. And I can guarantee that about 99% of you are going to look at one of the things. So I can instantly say which one you're going to be looking at. So ready? 3, 2, 1. So most of the people are actually going to be looking at pink fluffy unicorns dancing on rainbows. Why? Because I was cheating, obviously, because I'm using bright colors, I'm using movements, and it instantly draws our attention. Why is that? Because of that visual processing that draws us in immediately on the reflexive side. And on the other hand, we have that mathematical equation that is 322 for those of you wondering. And it is a bit more complex thinking. It allows us to think things through with focus and with focus to actually make sure we get this right as well. The thing is, when having this thing of psychology as well, it is data visualizations appeal to both an artistic and a scientific side. So there's an entire scientific thing in there that we can get to think about and making sure that the message comes across well, etc. But there is also a certain artistic flair to it. Some people just have that flair of instantly choosing a color palette that works perfectly well, and other people have to think things through. It is that artistic flair that is really important things as well. But it is the mix of both and applying both the right way that allows us to create truly, really well those data visualizations. Going into the let me quickly check if there's any questions. Nope. Okay, good. Let me quickly go into something the world calls pre-attentive attributes. And that's the basic for any of these scientific approaches for what we're seeing. And it is something that we see instantly when we look at a new page. And it is 4 basic properties going from color and form and movement and spatial positioning that our human brain starts to process as soon as we see this. Within about 200 milliseconds of the first exposure, our brain is trying to process these properties as well. And it can be in many different shapes and forms. As I mentioned before, the shape is a really important one because we can start playing around with length, with width, with how they are oriented, how they are curved, what the shape is, what the size is, if we are start adding marks in there as well, if we're adding enclosures in there. So there is a lot of things that we can do with this just by playing around with the form, etc. But we can do it as well with blurring, with grouping, and start using that spatial positioning with colors, by playing around with the grayscales. There's a lot of options that we can do, and our brain is going to process these instantly when we look at this for the first time. And then the 2D positioning is a really crucial one as well, because where we position things is really important. So when we're designing reports, movement is not always useful, because I don't always design reports with a moving element in this, but if we do, then yes, this is definitely something to take into account as well. But most importantly, the ones that really made me think about what I was doing was this thing called the principles of visual perception. So for instance, if I ask everyone in the room what this is, then most of the people are going to say to me, well, it is either a horse, a spotted horse, with its head here, kicking its hind leg, or most of the other people are going to say, no, it's a Dalmatian. And as soon as I make this into a moving image, then more people are going to notice, oh, yeah, it's a Dalmatian. You're right, completely correct. The thing is that our brain is trying to compose an image for us that it thinks it knows. Because it is a shape and form that it thinks it knows, it's going to make that suggestion to our brain and says, hey, I know this pattern. It's a Dalmatian. But it could be something else as well. It is our mind influencing us to take that decision. And by adding that moving element, it's a bit more visible as well, but it happens as well when it's just a static image. And this is something that is called the Gestalt principle of closure, meaning that our brain is going to try to complete the picture for us based on information that it's run into before. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? It depends on where and how we're using this. But as I mentioned, these Gestalt principles are actually a really interesting thing as well. I hear typing sounds. Does that mean there is a question? Yeah. No, Lukas, it could be a cow as well, but it's definitely a Dalmatian. Yeah. So these Gestalt principles are not a weird, funky Austrian guy somewhere in the 1700s. It is actually a school of thought in the 1900s, 1920s, 1930s in Germany and Austria, where these psychologists were working around form, etc., on how that influences behavior as well, on how form, shapes, and colors influences behavior. So Gestalt is German for form, and that is why they were working around it. And there is a bunch of these principles that they've defined, and not all of these principles are all super relevant for what we're doing with data visualization, but that's also not why they were designed. They were designed initially for product design, for designing phones, for designing doorknobs, for designing cars, etc. But a lot of these principles translate to user interface design and to data visualization as well, because it helps us to get users to understand something that we need. And it's by playing around with these principles, by understanding what they do, that we can actually start to understand what role the psychology things plays in how people understand a visual. What's going to happen when someone sees this? Can we influence this for good? Or can we help them understand the message a bit better? And how are they going to react when they first see this? But most importantly, these things help us determine what element is most effective. And it also allows us to influence a visual perception. But I do want to stress that it is our ethical duty as a data person to only do this for a good. Because I've seen many, many terrible examples where data is being, consciously misinterpreted to spread a false message for a fake news, for instance. The American elections were a masterclass on what not to do with data visualizations, etc. It is our moral and ethical duty to use this for good, to help people understand numbers better. But it also allows designers to point to a specific point, maybe even provoke people to take an action or think about what they're doing. But most importantly, it helps us design things that are intuitive, beautiful, and functional. And that's what it's about. So these Gestalt principles, they're usually displayed by looking at a collection of shapes. Right now, it is a gray circle. And most of us think that this is one group because they are all the same color, they are all the same shape, and they are tightly grouped together. So for us, for most people, this is one single group. So the second I change something in this, when I'm making these into black circles and black circles and black triangles, well, our mind is going to think that this is no longer a single group because they are a bit different from each other on the group thing. And that's why, for us, we're instantly seeing that they're not completely similar to each other anymore. And because of that similarity principle, it helps us to influence people to see if something is grouped together or not. So if I quickly jump to a Power BI report, I have this gigantic table of data, and it is total trips, total years to date over the years that I have here. So years 2016, 17, 19, and then 20. So if I give you this table on the first time, it is, that's a lot of things in there. I don't necessarily see how I should be looking at this as well. And then by one simple switch, please note that I'm not saying that you should do this on all of your tables, but by doing one simple switch, it actually becomes a lot more clear on which is related to each other. Then we can see that the baby blue columns are actually year to date, and the baby pink colors are actually just the regular versions as well. And it easily, because they are similar in color, our mind instantly knows that they are grouped together. I mentioned, do you need to do this in all your reports? No, there's more subtle ways of doing this, but in this demo, in these little examples, I just went for obvious things to make sure that the point comes across well. Then the same thing happens when we have these same things, orange circles right now, grouped together, same color, all look similar as well. So shape doesn't change. The only difference is rather than having 4 rows of 4, I'm moving them into 2 different equally groups. And because of the fact that they are no longer grouped together, our mind is going to think that they are a bit different as well, because of the fact that they are spatially positioned a bit different from each other. And that is called the principle of proximity. So if something is close to something else, then our mind will most likely be thinking that it is something that it's related to. And one of the things that I usually see this on, there's different things that we can do in Power BI for this, is a simple thing. This is not designed very well, I know, but I have 2 graphs, 2 simple graphs, and I have 2 slicers. So as soon as I start playing around with these slicers, then I'm noticing that only one of these visuals is changing with the other one. And that's a bit confusing because how do I know which of them is actually correlating with the other one? And it is a bit confusing because they are not grouped together in a very intuitive fashion. So by just switching this out and making sure that I have the slicers in the same area where they need to be, it is a simple switch that I can do to help them understand understand what they need to do and help make it a bit more intuitive as well. What else can we do with proximity? Well, we can play around with where we position our legends, where we position our titles, where we position our axes, etc. So there's a lot of different things that we can do with this to help people better understand what we need to be doing with this. So same thing. I think we all think there are two groups because we have gray and we have red circles. And then as soon as I start drawing some rectangles on these, things change, because right now it's not just two groups anymore, but it's being grouped into more different groups as well, because we are enclosing them as well. We are grouping them into a common region. And because they are sharing the same spatial slot, they have to be grouped together. Potentially, that's what our mind is thinking. So because of the fact where we're positioning them and how we're grouping them, that can play a very big role as well. So quickly switching to the same thing is I have 4 graphs, and I have 4 graphs that each do something, that are displaying something. So it is not necessarily clear to everyone when they're first looking at this, is that we're looking at the trips and that we're looking at the durations on the left-hand side and the trips on the right side. It is not necessarily clear for everyone when we're first looking at this. So again, one simple switch, by just drawing a simple rectangle around it, it is becoming a lot more clear on what we need to do with these things as well. By grouping them together, it is a lot more clear. Oh, okay, well, they are grouped together, so they have to be related to each other. They have to have some form of correlation to each other. And we can do exactly the same thing with different types of charts. We can do exactly the same with filters, with text boxes, etc. By making sure they are logically grouped in these containers, into these boxes, we can influence these things really, really well. Right? Aha. Again, this is one where we usually have lots of lively debates on this, is because it's different for a lot of people and how they start interpreting this. Because we have a red line that's shifting to this weird L movement, and then we have another one, a black line, that shifts also inside of this weird L movement. And meaning that it is, for a lot of people, they could follow the color primarily and then the shape, but there are other people that follow the shape first and then the color. But it is this principle called continuity where our mind decides for itself what they're going to follow primarily. Is it going to be color? Is it going to be the shape? Well, is it going to be the logical shape of things that we're following? And it is by using this that we can actually make sure that people can, it is something that we're not always going to be doing consciously, but it is something that can come into play when, for instance, our graphs are showing a weird pattern, etc. That our mind can potentially be a bit confused on what we're displaying in there as well. And the next one is for moving data as well. I mentioned that we're not always going to be showing moving data, but potentially if we're having 6 blue circles and 3 of them are moving upwards and 3 of them are moving downwards, because of the fact that they are going the same direction, that they share a common faith, then probably we'll be thinking that, oh, okay, well, they're moving in the same direction, so they'll probably have some form of relationship to each other. And there is a very, very common example of something that I want to show you right now as well, is that has to do with what we're doing with backgrounds. Because for most people, again, this is grounds for lots of discussions. Most people are either going to be seeing a black chalice on a white canvas, or they are going to be seeing 2 white faces on a black background facing each other. So it depends on what you're seeing, but it is the fact that we're using a background and a foreground picture to try and influence this message. Same thing with the Apple logo, etc. So it is the figure and ground principle where we play around with these 2 principles to actually try and do this thing ourselves as well. But one of the most common examples is that we're seeing is that people are just randomly plotting blue dots on there as well, on the map, for instance. But if I were to go to ask to a random American, can you please point me where the Horn of Africa is lying? Then they will have no clue that it's actually here. So by playing around with this thing with this principle, by giving them a background that they can correlate themselves on, or by having this background help stimulate the reception of the message, we can actually get some really good things. But we can do this with many different things. Using backgrounds inside of Power BI or data visualization can really help us convey the message a bit better. And cracking on, if you want to, for instance, make a specific point a bit more clear as well, we can use, in a limited form, we can use the shape or the form or the color to make it a bit contrary to other things, just by doing this ourselves as well. Just by using this very limitedly, we can point to a focal point where the attention needs to be drawn. So switching back to the Power BI report, because I did forget to show you one thing for continuity as well, is, for instance, if we're looking at this data visualization, most of the people, this will be a really confusing thing. Right now, it is just sorted on alphabetically. So it is, the graphs are jumping up and down, and it's not really clear for people what we're actually seeing. It is because of that continuity principle that it works best if we follow a upward or downward trending pattern. So again, by doing a simple switch, by making sure that the highest points are on the top or on the bottom, whatever we want to be doing, it allows people to actually more easily spot what is the highest value. Because if I ask people to do this in this type of visualization, then for instance, they will not be seeing the largest bars for Grove Street Path or Hamilton Park. So it is a really simple thing to just switch it around to make sure that people can watch and seeing the things in an upward or downward trending pattern. That helps things a lot. And by going into the focal point as well, it is, if I want people to specifically focus on Washington Street, for instance, just by simply changing the color specifically for that one, our attention immediately gets drawn to this as well. Thing is, we want to use this really, really carefully, because we cannot have more than two focal points on a single pane of canvas. Because if we add too many focal points, then everything will be a focal point and nothing will be a focal point. And that's something that we really need to be using inside of our heads as well, is that we use these things carefully to not overdo it. And going back to this principle of closure that I initially mentioned, it is our mind that's going to try to close off in shapes and objects that it's known, because it's seen this before as well. And by going into an example for a report, for a graph, for instance, our mind is going to try to complete these graphs, these lines that we're seeing, and it may not necessarily be the pattern that we're seeing. For instance, we would not have expected the little spike in August, for instance. So it is something that we do need to keep in mind as well, is that we cannot rely on the mind and the principle of closure for it to do a completely 100% accurate job on everything as well. So blast it through real quickly, because I have a lot of content that I want to show you, is Gestalt principles. And for me, they really, really make a lot of sense, because the Gestalt principles help me make the connection to what's happening inside of our mind and what we're doing with these data visualizations. So let me quickly spot if there is any questions. Nope. Okay. Let's move on. As I mentioned, let me take a sip real quickly. As I mentioned, it is also about choosing a right visualization, about making sure that we choose a visual that is right for the message that we want to portray. And that is something that is really crucial as well, because if we don't choose the right visual, then the message can be completely lost. For instance, if we use a pie chart to display 20 different categories, well, we're not going to see anything. And that's something that we really have to take into account. The thing is, to be able to select or to choose the right visual, we need to explore our data. We need to know what we have inside of our data. How do you explore your data? Well, if you want to do it with SQL, if you want to do it with R, with Python, with whatever tool you have, with Excel, go for it. Explore the data, make sure that you can get some insights in there as well. Usually, for me, it is a mixture of doing some SQL queries and making some simple graphs in Power BI that allow me to easily spot outliers or missing values, etc. Just quickly getting in there as well. So trying around things. But also is, if possible, speak with the business. Speak with those people that know how their processes work. People that know when, okay, well, if a certain value reaches this point or reaches that point, then we really need to think about what we're doing. what does it mean when a value reaches this? What does it mean when a value reaches that? Or if this value is, does a certain rule need to be triggered? Does a certain action need to be made? Is it important? It's those business people that will have that understanding. So we can create these visualizations, but it's the business that will have the actual contextual meaning to this. So after or during exploring that data, speaking with those people can really, really help us out as well. And then when we're exploring that data, when we're talking with people, we really want to pay extra attention to what we're seeing in amounts, what we're seeing in distribution. Are we having large distributions on the minimum side, on the maximum side? Is data always being centered around the middle point? What's the proportions like? Are we having data in the thousands, in the millions? Those types of things. So asking ourselves these questions will really help us select a right type of visual. So the thing is, we could go on for 2 days about all the different types of visualizations and what we should use when. Luckily, there are a few external websites out there that can help us make these decisions for ourselves as well. And the one that I personally like to use is the Financial Times visual vocabulary. And it is everything the Financial Times publishes, usually, is being made according to their visual vocabulary, following the standards and the guidelines that they have set in place. And it allows us to look at, well, if I have a change over time, what can I do? What are some things that I need to take into account? And this is just a really lean and mean thing that helps me make these decisions as well. Thing is, if you're not completely familiar with all these different types of visualizations, there is also a website called Data to Viz that we can use for this. And it gives us a bit more explanations. It gives us an example, or what's a violin plot? How can we use these? What are some things to keep in mind? What are some of the getches, the caveats? And it really helps us make these decisions. So again, if I have time series and I have one series, or I have several series, or if I want to go with numerical data that has 2 variables, is it ordered? Is it not ordered? It allows us to see what we can actually use. And this is really, 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 really interesting to help us get started with these things initially, to get some familiar things in our heads. Because yes, we can visualize everything with bar charts, column charts, and line charts, but sometimes we also want some other things in there as well. But it is using them to their strength that will make it a better visualization or not. So the slides will be shared. I will be sending the GitHub link into the chat window at the end of the session as well. All the links are in there, so you can just go to the links and start using these for yourselves as well. Because there is also a very important to note about what we're doing with color theory. What are we doing with colors? Because, okay, we've had the psychology part, we've had shapes and forms of what you can do, but what do we do with colors? Do we just randomly pick pink, yellow, and orange into one single color palette, or is there a bit more that we need to think of? And spoiler alert, yes, there is a bit more that we need to think of. So before I forget, because it is still me that we're talking about, I will paste in the link to my GitHub page in there, so you can grab the slides from there as well. But based for color theory, the thing that we need to know is that colors are a really, 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 really subjective thing. Not every person responds the same to a color. It can be because of that they have a certain form of color disability. It can be that they have a different cultural meaning. Because, for instance, the European people are all trained for green is good, red is bad. But if you go to Japan, they have a completely different cultural meaning. And that is something that we really need to take into account as well. Because if we have people with different cultures browsing these reports, then we need to make sure that the colors can be interpreted well as well. Luckily, this entire thing of color theory is based on research to help us decide what we can do with this. And there is a simple step plan that we can follow to make a lot of these decisions for us. Right now, I'm going to focus on the HSL model. It is an alternate version of the RGB model. We have different things as well that we can use, but right now it is hue, which is what people describe to as a color. So red, green, blue, orange, whatever. And then we have a saturation, which means how intense is that color, or, well, it's a scale of how much this color differs from a neutral gray. And then we have the luminance, where we describe on how much amount of black, how much black was added to play around with this spectrum as well of that color. So the combination of these three allows us to pick out of millions and millions of colors based on those base colors that we have. And in that step plan, it is about knowing that data. The data exploration that I mentioned as well for selecting the visual is exactly the same for picking out the colors, because if we know the data, then we will know what we need to be visualizing for this as well. And we want to decide on the aspect of the data we want to be representing. Do we want to show the sales value? Do we want to show the average units that have been bought into a single order? Do we want to simply list out a list of people that have bought, a cohort analysis of people that have bought into the last 3 weeks, for instance? All these different things will determine what we want to be doing with our colors. The thing is, try to decide on the aspect, so sales, units, averages, whatever, that we want to represent, and then stick to one single color for that aspect. And then if need be, then we can start playing around with color scales, adding more black, differing it a bit more from neutral gray, or maybe even play around with some of the base colors in there as well, to just help us get a bit more difference in these colors. And then as soon as we have those aspects, what's the scale of the data? Is it sequential? Is it data ranging from a low to a high point, which is most of the times as well? Is it diverging data where we have a lot of data points at the minimum side, a lot of data points at the maximum side, and then they are diverging inwards towards an important pivotal point in the middle? Or is it qualitative data, which doesn't even have an order of magnitude? It's just a list of names, a list of categories, or whatever we want to be visualizing on a graph. This will really help us make these decisions as well. But before we go and make decisions, look at obvious options. Is it data that we're trying to visualize that is already being used in nature or in person? The example I always give is, if I give each and every one of you a bag of M&Ms, and I ask you, please give me the distribution of the colors of M&Ms that are inside of the bag, then hopefully most of you will pick yellow for yellow M&Ms, green for the green M&Ms, blue for the blue M&Ms, etc. Because these colors match with what we're trying to understand. Is it necessarily going to be the greatest color palette ever? Maybe not, but it is something that we'll instantly understand as well. Is there a corporate style guide? And a corporate style guide is a very important starting point, because it allows us for fonts and base colors that we're trying to use. The thing is, do look at these corporate style guides with caution, because corporate style guides are designed for printing, for ads, for documents, those kinds of things. They're not necessarily designed for data visualizations. So the color palettes that have been designed for printing may not necessarily translate well to a data usage. So don't blindly just adapt it to the corporate style guide, because it's possible that you're doing some things that will not work together well. Most importantly, it's about picking the colors that users will understand. That plays to those similarity principles that we also just mentioned before as well, that people will understand and that people can use for them as well. So, okay, we have our 3 steps down. What hues, what base colors are we actually going to be using? Sequential data is usually just one base color and then playing around with hue, luminance, or saturation to define scale. Just playing around, making it go from a lighter shade to a darker shade, or we can just stick to the same color as well, depending on what we need to be doing. Thing is, those changes in luminance and saturation can be quite hard to perceive. So if we're going from a very light end to a very dark end and we're doing it really subtly, then those changes will not necessarily come over really well. And if, for instance, we have a scale containing more than 5 data points, it might be better using 2 hues, 2 base colors to start using for these different scales. The thing is that you have to know is that they have to be a bit similar to each other as well. They have to be next to each other on the color wheel, but I will get back to that as well. So the diverging data, where we have those data, lots of data in the minimum and the maximum side, and then going back to each other to the middle, that is usually where we take 2 different colors and then play around decreasing the saturation, making sure that they go to a neutral gray or white or black, whatever, in the middle point. So going from a more brighter color to a more neutral color in the middle. And then if we're looking at that qualitative data, so data that doesn't necessarily have a value, so names, categories, whatever, then you usually go for as many hues as values. The thing is, we want to make sure that we don't place 20 different colors on there, for instance, as well, because our human mind will have issues perceiving that much different colors as well. Most importantly is about consistency. Consistency in your own reports, but preferably also as a standard within your team or within your organization. Because if you're consistently using the yellow base color or the red base color for your sales, then people will start developing this thing called a mental map. They will know that, oh, okay, that color, that usually means sales, so it has to mean the same thing as well. They will recognize this as well, because it leans more from going from that right-hand side to the more left-hand side, because it is very, very familiar for them, and that these principles of closure and similarity are coming into play as well. And it helps them leverage those pre-attentive attributes a lot better if those colors are used consistently the same. So preferably, if you can, try to share a set of best practices within the team, within the organization, to make sure that end users can better understand these values as well. And then one of the ones that I prefer, that I like the most, is don't fear the gray. Not everything has to be a vibrant color. Not every background has to be a gradient going from 2 colors into each other. Not everything has to be bright, flashy, neon pink, whatever watermelon shade we're using, because it is, okay, yes, our mind is naturally drawn to a vibrant color. The thing is that at the end of the day, if we're constantly looking at these really bright, flashy colors, we're all going to have a headache. And I'm a big stickler for designing a sober report that has the neutral colors, even gray colors, and then adding splashes of color through the things that I think are really, really important. It is, as I mentioned, a really subjective thing. Not everyone feels the same way. I respect other people's opinions as well, but try it out for once. Just, for instance, consider creating the next report completely in gray, black, and white, playing around with the grayscales, and then only start adding colors. Why is this? Because for me, it also helps me think about where I'm positioning things. How am I placing things? What am I trying to correlate with what? And the second I add those most colors to it, I will already have that understanding, and it will allow me to more easily pick the right color palette for what I'm trying to do. And then for creating the actual palette, finally on step 7, we want to decide if we want to have a warm or a cool base. So a warm base is the more vibrant colors going from yellow and orange and red and purple to the more darker colors from blue and green, etc. If we want to have, that's what we need to decide on as well, is do we want to go for that warmer shade? Do we want to go for that cooler shade? And then there are a number of ways that we can look at this color. For instance, if we have that sequential data, just the values that we need to have going from a low to a high, then we can go for a monochromatic approach. So a single hue ranging with multiple shapes. So playing around with shades, playing around with luminance and with saturation for creating a bit more different colors for those. We can also go ahead and start looking at these analog colors. So colors that sit next to each other on the color wheel. So yellow, orange going into each other. Just to make sure that we can get a bit more Well, a more varied alternative for sequential data. Do keep in mind that we cannot use too many of these different colors because otherwise our brain will also have a harder time to perceive these switches. And then for that diverging data with large volumes at the minimum side, large volumes at the maximum side, going towards a neutral point. Complementary colors are usually a really good pick. So colors that sit on the opposite side of the color wheel. And then if we pair these with a neutral white or gray, that's perfect for those types of visualizations. And then if we're looking for qualitative palettes, we can look at triadic colors, we can use at compound colors. So just making sure that we use the different shapes of the color wheel to actually help us make these decisions for us. So luckily, there are lots of tools out there that can help us make these decisions for us. So the one that I typically use, like I said, there's lots of template generators out there. The one that I typically use is Adobe Color. And why do I use this one? Well, it is something that for me is a bit more interesting than the other ones because it allows me to instantly check for accessibility issues as well. But for instance, I know right now, that's something I've learned, that the middle one is the one that helps me choose the actual color. The one that helps me choose the actual color, and then I can play around with these. I can play around with the values, and I can make myself an entirely new color as well. And then if I want to say, okay, well, I want to have an analog color, I want to have a monochromatic approach, I want to have a triadic approach, I want to have a complementary approach, it allows me to easily change these things as well. But I can also just go ahead and start changing these things to select the color palette that I want. And then as soon as I think, okay, this is going to be my color palette, I can easily go over to my accessibility tools, and then I can see that, oh, okay, well, I maybe thought that it was going to be interesting, but well, they are in conflict because for people with with these two forms of color blindness, they may not necessarily be really well to perceive because it's too similar for them, and it allows me to easily check if the color palette that I want to be using for them is useful or not. Which seamlessly brings me into the point that I want to touch on a bit as well, is that making sure that we can get as much people to enjoy the fruits of our labor and making sure that they can actually use that report as well. So Megan Longoria, she is an American MVP, who's been a very vocal advocate for accessibility in report design, has a really, really, really well designed checklist for everyone that they can look at. Are the fonts large enough? Are we using enough contrast? Are the colors we're using, are they well enough as well? And I'm not saying that you need to do each and every one of them for the next report that we're designing, but I want to ask you, I want to challenge you to gradually start including more of these different things into the designs that we're making, just to make sure that we can get as much people on board to understand the data sets that we have as well. And then last step, if we have a theme that we're all happy with, then create a theme file, making sure that we can reuse these efforts, making sure that we can reuse that theme file with other users, other teams, maybe even other departments in the organization. And there are options, for instance, at Power BI Tips to generate a theme for us that we can use for these exact purposes as well. And then going into a few takeaways is I didn't dive into this with all too much detail, but I usually try to go for removing clutter, making sure that my dashboard, that my report is a sober thing to easily allow users to understand what's on there. So no 25 different visuals on a single piece of canvas, but just making sure that it is not an overload of things that are being bombarded into people's faces. By managing white space, for instance, by making sure there is white space in between these different visuals. But also look at these Gestalt principles and these pre-attentive attributes that we've just mentioned. Think about the visualizations you're using, think about the colors we're using, and use them wise. So not everything has to be a bright, vibrant color. We can also just use it with limited usage, etc. And then keep accessibility in mind to make sure that people can actually consume the reports that we're trying to use as well. And then, well, tell a story. Because with the data visualization that we're trying to design, we're making sure that we get people on board to look at the data, to look at the message that we found and that we want them to understand. And then to close off, there is this really interesting thing going on called Workout Wednesday, and it is running on Twitter, it's running on LinkedIn, it's running on the website that I've linked here as well, and it is a weekly challenge designed to look at Power BI or Tableau, and it is just simple things going up in increasing complexity, designed to help you get familiar with certain aspects of Power BI. Do we want to make an age pyramid? Do we want to make an intro to chart articulator? Do we want to have tags tell us if it's a cat or a croissant? Just simple things that help us understand better these things that we have inside of Power BI, but there are also Tableau challenges that we, for instance, can use as well. They take about 15 to 20 to 30 minutes each week, and they also post the solution video with that, and it is just a really fun way of making sure that you can learn new things about data visualization each and every week. So within this slide deck, I've posted the link inside of a chat. There is a bunch of reading material, a bunch of references, etc. in there, just so for you to make sure that you can get these things that I've tried to blast through right now as well. So going back to Avatar Land, let me see if there's any questions. All right. Nope. If you have any questions, feel free to start asking those questions now. We have about 4 minutes left, which means that I have room for your questions. While waiting for people that are typing, thank you for having me. It's been wonderful virtually seeing you in Avatar Land. I hope to one day actually come to SQLDay in person, because I've heard many great things about it. And then, let's see. Do I use buttons on dashboards, for example, for navigation? Lukas, that is an excellent question. Yes, I actually do, but I have deliberately left it out because navigation is a topic completely on its own as well. But it's a bit the same thing. It's about making sure where we position it, making sure that it's obvious that is clear to understand where we're trying to send people, that those buttons, that they are well designed. But that is a really short answer for a topic that deserves its own session of an hour. But yes, I do use buttons. They can be really, really helpful to help people navigate what I try to be on the story that I try to create for them. Robert, I posted, let me post the link in there again. You can find the presentation on the GitHub page that I've shared. There you can just download it. Do I use tooltips, Mikal? Same answer as I said to buttons. Yes, I use tooltips to help people, to help portray the message that I want people to understand. The thing is that with tooltips, we have very limited screen estate that we can use. So it is a matter of only trying to pinpoint the information that we desperately want users to understand, to put that on the tooltip and not just add another overload of information on there. But it can be, for instance, used on if we have a graph outlaying a specific trend. A tooltip can, for instance, be used to get a bit more details on why this is lower, why this is higher, those types of information as well. So tooltips can be really, really powerful. The thing is, with tooltips, is not everyone instantly realizes that these tooltips are there. So it is also a bit about user education and user adoption, that they are aware that these options, that these tools are there for them to use. Okay, well, if there's questions, feel free to put them in the chat or ping me on the social channels. Other than that, thank you for being here. Enjoy the rest of the day. Enjoy the rest of tomorrow as well at SQLDay. And I hope to meet each and every one of you in the future. Thank you.